It's raining, so the lighting is truly epic out here. But I have finished a strange titled book. Wrong way. Strange titled book. Called Killing John Wayne. It is by Ryan, and I can't pronounce his last name very well. Uytdewilligen, I think. I'll put it down below. It's a monstrous last name that I cannot pronounce. But this book is subtitled The Making of the Conqueror. It's about the disastrous filming of the movie called The Conqueror that was about Genghis Khan, supposedly that John Wayne was the lead in, where he was playing Genghis Khan. It has become kind of a notorious bad movie. It's not played a lot of times in the realm of bad movies that I see, that are bad movies that are so bad they're funny. The Conqueror is not really so bad it's funny. It's just sort of just a disaster. And it's just a disaster of a movie. It was made in a time that yellowface was still a prevalent thing in the movies, and it was made way over budget. And it was also made in not a nuclear site, but a site that was downwind of nuclear testing. And that's actually a lot of what this book is about, as well as the history of RKO and sort of what happened here. The author does a really, really good job here with this, about really, really highlighting what was going on with the nuclear testing and how much the government lied to people living in the area. This seems like this would just be a book about the movie making. I thought it was just going to be an entertainment type of book where they kind of do a detailed thing about how the movie was made and sort of what went wrong, because I've read other books about that. There's a pretty popular one that's about how the Super Mario Brother movie just was a disaster from beginning to end. But Killing John Wayne, this is not just about the making of the movie. They talk about how RKO, with Howard Hughes in charge, how that sort of got to the state that it was, that this kind of weird movie ended up even being made at all, and why John Wayne would even do this, because it was so against type that he's cowboys. I mean, that's just, he couldn't really act wonderfully, so cowboys and a certain type of cowboy was pretty much all he could do. And to kind of go against type and get him into this role where he's playing Genghis Khan, like the military roles make sense that he had, and sort of the stolid, serious doesn't really require a whole lot, but this is just kind of crazy for anybody even to think that this was going to work ever. And just the sort of disaster that ended up, even without the nuclear situation, this was a disaster of a movie and a disaster of funding. Now, when it came to actually making money back, it wasn't that big of a disaster. I think people make it out a lot bigger than it was. It just couldn't compete with a lot of the other movies that were being made at the time. It was kind of just it was a lot of money for something that was not going to get a lot of money return-wise. So it was not the truly epic disaster when it came out that we think of it sort of now. And I'd heard many times about this one, that, oh yeah, all the actors and a lot of the crew people and all sorts of stuff ended up getting cancer afterwards because they were in this site that was downwind of radioactivity. They were doing testing in Nevada. And what ended up happening is the government kept coming out saying, oh, this is all safe. Remember, this is the 50s where everybody was all completely infatuated with atomic power and atomic bombs and atomic energy, and didn't really, I suppose with it having won the war, there was this idealization of it, whereas the stuff's really, really dangerous, and there was not really a lot of acceptance of how dangerous it was, partially because the government kept covering that up. And that's where you get into the main focus of this book, which is about, yes, a lot of the people who did work on this movie and different things did end up with health problems and cancer and different stuff. But the argument can also be made that a lot of these people were heavy smokers too, because that was another thing that was going on at the time that they had not addressed, and no one was saying anything about that being bad for health yet. So again, when we talk about John Wayne, he was a chain smoker, and he did eventually die of what was metastasized lung cancer. So it's hard to really pinpoint what would have caused it. Now, what the author gets more into is about the situation with the people actually living in the area and the studies that were done and how many of those studies were covered up because they made the government look bad. Well, yes, you were testing and people got sick. So yes, you're going to look bad. You're going to look negligent because on top of that, you then lied to them for a long amount of time. They were basically just telling people, you'll be fine. Just maybe go inside when you see the sky turn a weird color and move on your way. The whole thing, and then they made it really, really hard for these people to get compensation when they'd had a family member die. It's very shady. It's very, very, very underhanded, everything that was done here by the government when it comes to being forthcoming about the atomic testing that was being done. Basically right up the road. These people were living in a constant sort of, they were called downwinders because they were in a constant sort of fog of nuclear dust all the time. And the whole situation was just, these people were just lied to. And this was a time that everybody was very, very trusting of the government. It's not like now. And they just, basically the government felt like the testing outweighed anything else that would be a result of any of that. And the situation is just very sad, and it is very good that this author, and this is a very readable book too. There are a few typos in it, which I've been catching a lot lately in books, and I don't know if that's just me suddenly catching them or just editing not being what it once was. But yeah, there's a few typos in here that, like, one time I think they use like the opposite of a word. Instead of increase, they use decrease. It's something like that. But there's a few little things like that. But other than that, no, this is very, very, very readable and very informative because he's done a lot of research into what went on and what went on with the atomic testing. And kind of at that time, even then they said they had stopped atomic testing, they were still doing it. They were doing it underground. I didn't know about the one that, and I'm a former history teacher, I didn't know about the one that blew up underground, that the top came off of the thing and it bled out a huge amount of nuclear waste and stuff into the air. So the just level of everything that was going on here and just the way that the country embraced atomic stuff and how dangerous we know that it is now is interesting. Also interesting, if you're interested in movie history, RKO's rise and fall is strictly at the hands of Howard Hughes, who was a horrible monster, but strictly at the hands of Howard Hughes, and just how that movie studio ended up all tied up in this. How John Wayne even ended up tied up in this at all because he was trying to extricate himself from a 2-picture deal that he'd made with Hughes, and he just wanted it over with so he could move on and do another movie. So he just kind of accepted this one and was like, okay, just make this movie so I can move on, and kind of the relationship that was going on there. Susan Hayward's just sort of really tumultuous personal life and her situation that had happened. It just, there's a lot going on in this book which makes this really, really readable outside of just we made a bad movie. Just to evidence one of the stories that that he tells in here, apparently they had heard about, when they got there and started making the movie, they heard about, oh my word, there is a nuclear testing site up the road. We really don't want to be here. And John Wayne, being Mr. I trust the government and everything like that in all America, he was like, no, he gives a big rah-rah speech and tells everybody, it's all perfectly safe. The government wouldn't lie to us. And then he said, I'll even get a Geiger counter. So he gets a Geiger counter and goes up on the hill to go test it, and it just immediately starts screaming. He turns it off, and then he turns it on again, and it immediately starts screaming again. He's like, well, this thing's broken. Obviously, that was not the case. And they get even more and more into, they were covering people in this dust that had contamination in it and all. But they cannot, what it comes down to is they cannot, just because they made a movie there, pinpoint that they were in the contamination long enough for anybody who got cancer afterwards or had health issues afterwards to actually relate it to the testing that was going on. So no one who was involved in the movie, even though they sort of kind of go along a little bit with that theory, he seems to think that theory is plausible as he writes, but even if you go along with that, he's like, there's no way anybody could have actually taken the blame of what happened with all the people who made this movie, outside of it just being a terrible disaster of a movie. But incredibly interesting book when it comes to sort of the ins and outs of old Hollywood, the old Hollywood system, and also about atomic history in the United States and the people in the United States who were so affected by the atomic testing. That is something we don't hear about much, because even now I think the government kind of does a pretty good job of, in history, does a pretty good job of kind of glossing that over a little bit, about the fact that we sort of poisoned our own people in the process here and contaminated all of this. And he does a very good job of blaming, I think, who has the rightful blame in it, and he's not completely condemning. There does not feel in the writing an overwhelming feeling of bias towards everything. This just feels like he's done his research and is like, yeah, that's what seems like it happened based off of everything I can find. I'm surprised I've never heard of this book before. This is just a book I picked up at Goodwill because I thought the cover was interesting, and it sort of looked like it was playing off those lines of those books that are killing Kennedy and killing Lincoln and all those ones that what's his name keeps doing, and having a co-writer do basically for him and Glenn Beck, I think, that keeps doing for everything. But this seemed like a play on that. And it seemed like it was supposed to be just about the movie. It turned into being much more, also about American history a great deal, and the 50s, and studio history, and atomic history, and how that it was treated in the country. And really, if you can get your hands on this one is really, really fascinating, and way better than I thought. I really ended up not being able to put this down. That it was way more in-depth and informative than I thought it was initially going to be. So, did the government kill John Wayne? Maybe. It certainly had a hand in killing a lot of other people when it came to the atomic testing.